Let me welcome you all to the first seminar meeting, first seminar of the year. I'm Ashutosh Varshney, director of the Saxena Center, and which is the main sponsor of this this seminar series, South Asia Seminar, and also a professor in political science department here. It seems to me there are two basic issues at stake. Let's start with those basic issues or questions first to set the stage for what we're going to discuss. The title, as you know, is Political Crisis in Pakistan, very well covered in the newspapers, especially, of course, South Asian newspapers, but also British newspapers, and to substantial extent American newspapers. What happened is the first issue. And why it happened is the second issue. Journalists have done their job and given us a fairly good reportage on what happened. There's always room for further factual discoveries or reasonably strong, good factual hunches which might not have been adequately noted in the popular reportage. But it's the second question, why it happened, what happened, why it happened, for which we need scholars. It's not that journalists don't have an explanation for that, but the whole job of scholarship is to go underneath, to see if, to detect if some underlying issues, some underlying concerns ought to be highlighted a great deal more than what we've noted in popular reportage. Now, if we look at the second question, why it happened, and a scholarly analysis of that, then it seems to me there are three sets of issues, and I haven't had a prior discussion with our panelists about this. I don't know whether they'll answer these questions or they would like to answer these questions, or whether, in their opinion, these questions are indeed as relevant as I'm making them out to be. But here they are, according to my judgment. In what ways are the recent political events leading finally to the arrest of Imran Khan, another former prime minister arrested? In what ways are these events, starting with his fall until his arrest, and quite a bit before, a continuation of underlying trends and problems in Pakistan's polity? All of us political scientists, when we think about the questions we study, we think in longue durée and we think in analytic terms, and a bit more about this in a moment. And in what ways are the recent political events a striking departure from underlying trends? So there are clearly two big analytic issues here, and a third, at a deeper level, are there political science theories or tools which can help us analyze the recent developments? Or, alternatively, is a knowledge of Pakistan's history enough to analyze why what happened did happen without reference to political science theories? I think we should be open to both ideas, that a historically rooted analysis is enough to explain, or that we have very good theories in political science, especially on civil-military relations, or to the extent that foreign actors, powerful foreign actors, might, under certain circumstances, determine domestic political events. We have, that's a very political science question. And there's popular reportage about it, and there is serious scholarly analysis, and I think my sense is that our panelists at least would partially address what I have laid out. Initially, there were three speakers. Aqil Shah, whose book I found extremely enlightening, published by Harvard in 2014 on the Army and Democracy, is not with us because of COVID. So there is a recent spurt in COVID infections, all milder, but once you get it, you're not supposed to travel. And he informed us 2 days ago that he has it. And the others also on this campus I've heard who are COVID positive now. So we are left with two very remarkable scholars, and they'll enlighten us. Fahd Humayun is an assistant professor of political science at Tufts after his bachelor's from LSE and PhD from Yale very recently, 2022. So his arrival in the Boston Providence area is recent, and I hope he'll be a more vital member of our community of scholars studying South Asia in this area. He is an IR scholar, to use political science terms. I'll explain that for non-political scientists in a moment. IR scholar with a regional focus on South Asia, and more simply spoken, he studies the domestic causes of security crises and international conflict with a regional focus on South Asia. And Niloufer Siddiqui, who's been here before, and we welcome her again, is an assistant professor of political science at the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy at the University of Albany in the great Hudson Valley, beautiful Hudson Valley, State University of New York, SUNY Albany. It is still called SUNY Albany? No, it's it's University of Albany, but previously known as SUNY Albany. Yes. Her first book, Under the Gun, Political Parties and Violence in Pakistan, was published by Cambridge University Press last year. And her work has been forthcoming or has been published in APSR, American Political Science Review, Journal of Politics, JOP, Comparative Political Studies, CPS, Party Politics, International Studies Quarterly, Journal of Experimental Political Science, Conflict Management and Peace Studies, and Foreign Policy and Analysis in Politics and Religion. Some of these are traditional journals, some of these are very, very new journals, and some are traditional journals reinvented as new journals. So that's the nature of how a discipline evolves. They were supposed to speak for 20 minutes each, all three. I have, given that Aqil is not here, I told them 25 to 30 minutes would be very legitimate. And we'll start with, and then we'll open up for Q&A. We'll start with Niloufer, because she'll focus on the domestic side of the crisis, and then we'll move on to Fahd Humayun for the external, for a more systematic treatment of the external dimension. So Niloufer, welcome again.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks all for being here. I'm really happy to be here. Always good, exciting to be talking about Pakistan, and obviously this time is no exception. There is a lot to talk about with regards to Pakistan's current political crisis. And so as I was thinking about what is the best way to focus my remarks, I thought that maybe I would think about the unfolding events not just from the perspective of the military. Now, obviously, the military has to be part of any conversation about Pakistan, but what I wanted to do was think a little bit more about the political parties and the voters, so the citizenry more at large. And I wanted to address two questions, and Ashu said that he has a series of questions that he thinks are important, and he had not discussed them with us prior, but coincidentally, one of the primary questions that I wanted to address was the same one that Ashu raised, which is in terms of the last 5 years, how similar and how different are they from previous iterations of the hybrid regime that we have seen in this country, and particularly in terms of the role provided to political parties. So the role that's been provided to political parties over the last 5 years in this latest iteration of the hybrid regime, what continuities do we see from previous iterations of the hybrid regime, and what differences do we see? And then second, and this is also related to the first question, we have seen a fair amount of political mobilization over the last, certainly over the last year, over the last 5 or 6 years more generally, and we've also seen a fair amount of military repression. And so when we think about these two trends happening simultaneously, what can we expect going forward in terms of voter autonomy and then in terms of democratic consolidation more broadly? So just to preview where my discussion will be going, I will be arguing that while there have been moments over the past year or the past 2 years that are indeed unprecedented, there are also stark similarities with previous episodes in Pakistan's history, and these similarities have largely been overlooked in contemporary discourse and conversation that's happening in the country and outside. And to the extent that I believe that things are somewhat different, I suggest that it is, in fact, the changing role of the voter more than any other institution in Pakistan today that is proving important in evolving dynamics. And it is this changing role that I think can help explain some of the developments at the macro level. And so while the hybrid regime of the 1990s and then again of the mid-2000s, while these regimes were able to largely discount the role of the Pakistani populace and they were able to determine governing strategies at the elite level, I think this way of conducting politics began to face pressure in contemporary Pakistan, especially in the period right after in 2022 and then the year prior to that as well. And it is, I think, the popular backing that Imran Khan received and the willingness of voters to newly hold parties to account that provided him and his party, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, the space to challenge the military, however brief this challenge ultimately proved to be. And this also meant that the rival parties of the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, or PMLN, and the Pakistan People's Party, or the PPP, have not been able to merely ignore the narrative that the PTI has carefully constructed over the previous decade about these parties being corrupt and of them being representative of an old elite. And I think the events, many of you will agree, many experts seem to suggest that the events of May 9th caught the military by surprise. And I think they also brought to light some of the constraints that the military is up against. And the events that we saw after May 9th, I think, are representative of those constraints. Given, obviously, where we stand today, I'm not going to argue that the military has not, once again, reestablished its supremacy. But I also think that we should not discount some of the developments that we have seen over the past few years, and is on these developments that I will be focusing on today. But before we get into some of this argument, let's take a minute to think a little bit historically about how the hybrid regime has developed in Pakistan. So we can see here in this graph, it uses Polity 5 data. So Polity 5 data codes countries from a scale of -10 to +10. Negative numbers are more autocratic, positive numbers are more democratic. And so you can see here in this graph that Pakistan, really since its independence, has oscillated between more democratic rule and more autocratic rule pretty consistently, right? So it's kind of up and down in its pattern. And scholars have put forward a number of theories to explain why the military has intervened in Pakistan, and these have ranged from a power vacuum, which is left by incompetent or corrupt civilian leaders, to ambitious generals, to suggestions that perhaps the Pakistani populace is just not ready for democracy. And regardless of the preferred theory, what is clear is that this constant intervention or involvement of the military in politics has prevented democratic consolidation and has also affected political party development. And I think this is important for us to consider, especially when we're thinking in terms of political parties and how they make their strategies, is that, we know this, no prime minister has completed his or her term in the history of Pakistan since 1947, and only a handful of elected governments have completed their terms as well. And this is largely, the military's involvement in politics has meant that political parties have operated in short-term horizons, and they know that the rules of the game might change tomorrow. And so in this context, parties have largely refrained from developing strong party organizations. They have had to rely on an overlapping group of electables for vote mobilization. Their leadership is largely dynastic. These organizations are centered primarily around one family, one individual. And of course, they have had to enter into implicit and explicit arrangements with other institutions in society, most notably that of the military. And so if we look back at the 1990s, this was a time period in which the two political parties of the day, the PPP and PMLN, they alternated power almost consistently across that decade, right, for a couple of years here and there. And during this time, we had a particular form of hybrid regime. This was known as the Troika hybrid regime. This term was used to describe the power sharing agreement between the president, the chief of army staff, and the prime minister for civilian military consensus. In 1997, we had the 13th Amendment, and this reduced the powers of the president, and it strengthened instead the position of the prime minister, and it removed this third element, or the third actor in the troika. Some suggest that after 2008, when the hybrid regime continued again, it was without the president, and perhaps a politicized judiciary had now taken its place in this new iteration of the hybrid regime. Nawaz Sharif and Benazir Bhutto, who are pictured here today, so the respective leaders of the PPP and the PMLN, in 2006, perhaps realizing their mistakes and their experience of the 1990s, they signed a Charter of Democracy. So this charter was a document in which both parties pledged not to approach the army to come to power or dislodge a democratic government. So the hybrid regimes that formed after the signing of this Charter of Democracy saw perhaps a greater willingness of the PPP and the PMLN to see through each other's terms. And this is what we saw in 2013, and then what we saw happen once again in 2018. Again, however, when we get to a period between 2018 and 2022, this brought further changes. And perhaps the most obvious of these changes was the entry of a third actor, right? So far we'd had these two primary civilian parties fighting for civilian control at the center, and now we had the entry of Imran Khan and his political party, the PTI. And this meant that perhaps it was the exposure also of a flaw in the Charter of Democracy, because ultimately the charter was signed between two political parties, and in fact it was really between two personalities, right? So the very strong personalities of Benazir and Nawaz. So now we had a new variant of the hybrid regime. This hybrid regime was in large part different from previous iterations because, and this is arguably for the first time, but if we count Zulfikar maybe for the second time, we had the military now with a popular civilian leader whose narrative and ideology was consistent with their own. So this was a nationalist narrative which centered Islam, placed Islam at the center of the country's vision. And I'll be talking about this narrative, which I think is quite important, in just a few minutes as well. But so this hybrid regime became, again, famously referred to as the same-page hybrid regime. And this was one where the civilians and the military had a more explicit arrangement in which the two could govern almost simultaneously, where they were set to share each other's worldview. And this arrangement was lauded by the PTI. It was thought to be indicative of good governance when the country's premier institution and its governing party could be aligned on all metrics. I mean, while we're saying that, though, we have to understand that this good governance was at its core illiberal. So we saw during this time an increase in restrictions on press freedoms, an increase in restrictions on civil society, a purging of bureaucrats, and an increase in surveillance. And I think rather than incidental to the same-page regime, these features were integral to it. While things looked relatively stable for a time period, not unlike other hybrid regimes in Pakistan's history, this era of the same page also collapsed spectacularly in 2022. And it ended perhaps with one of the most direct challenges that the military has faced, that a civilian political leader has made to the military in recent years. So Imran Khan faced a no-confidence motion. This led to his ouster, and it brought to power instead a coalition party known as the Pakistan Democratic Movement, and to the position of Prime Minister it brought Shehbaz Sharif, the brother of Nawaz Sharif and a member of the PMLN. Imran Khan also controversially alleged that the military was involved in an assassination attempt against him, And this standoff ultimately culminated in the arrest of Imran Khan on May 9th, and violent protests that we saw that occurred right after. So as we consider the way in which these many events over the last few years have unfolded, I think it's important for us to focus for a bit on how Pakistani citizens have responded to these political developments. And I don't want you to take my remarks that follow as indicative that I don't think the military matters. Obviously it matters, right? But I think sometimes in conversations about civil and military relations, we tend to ignore members of the Pakistani populace. We tend to ignore Pakistani voters. And so what I want to do is focus a little bit on the reactions of the voters to these events and how these reactions have potentially affected the ways in which both the military and the political parties function and the decisions that they make. So first, when we think about the support that the PTI has received, and this is kind of a rich debate and argument that's occurring both in Pakistan and abroad, it's a question of how much organic support does Imran Khan and the PTI, how much organic support do they really have? And for this, I think we need to look back at the 2018 elections. I think that, no one, again, can convincingly argue that political parties competing in 2018 were competing on an even playing field. I think it's pretty clear. I think a lot of assessment and analysis and so on has demonstrated that, and while there is disagreement over the extent to which these elections were manipulated or the extent to which these elections were rigged, at the very least, certain parties were disadvantaged, and pressure was placed on local elites, also known as electables, to switch parties. But even as we acknowledge that this potential unevenness of the playing field and the potential role that the military played, I think it's important to note that the PTI nonetheless showed that it was a very viable third option to the PPP and the PMLN, which again had long dominated politics in Pakistan, right? The PTI also very importantly showed that it was an important player in Karachi, right? A Karachi that had long been dominated by ethnic politics, that had long been dominated by the tussle between the MQM and others, and it presented what some people call the post-ethnic option in Karachi as well, right? So what we have to acknowledge, I think, is that while we can debate the extent to which their narrative resonated, it's very clear that at least in some parts of the country and amongst some groups of the populace, the narrative did resonate. A closer look at election data, however, does not fully, I think, support the narrative that there was a drastically changing electorate or a drastically changing nature of party voter linkages. There's been a lot of talk about PTI's so-called youth bank or the nature of its mobilization of previous people who have never voted before, like first-time voters. But if you look at exit poll data, so this is Gallup Pakistan's exit poll data from 2018, you actually see that the PTI voter was not all that different from the average voter in the country. So the PTI voter was somewhat younger and more urban, but it wasn't much younger or much more urban. And it was somewhat more educated and somewhat wealthier, but again, not by much. And the PTI actually had a lead in all age groups, except in the age category of 35 to 49. So this is just a screenshot from a Gallup report. And so what we should be looking at is the column on the other side over there, this is 2018. And so you can see that the PTI did have more support across all age groups, except for this age group of 35 to 49. But the lead was not so great, right? Among new voters, the difference between PPP and PTI was just 1%, right? And so I think these numbers should make us question, right, the narrative that exists of how the PTI voter is so different from the voter that was historically the voter of the PPP or the PMLN. So what I think what was happening really was that two simultaneous trends were occurring in 2018. And so one involved this group of mostly urban citizens who were mobilized by PTI's anti-corruption, PTI's anti-Western narrative. But the second was the continuation of politics of the old or the Purana Pakistan, right? And by this I mean the politics of electable switching parties from one to the other, bringing their vote bank with them, the continuation of the patron-client politics with which we are so familiar. And I think really what was happening was the simultaneous occurrence of these trends. I like this picture because it's like Purana Pakistan, but the guy on the cell phone, right? So it's really showing how we are seeing these developments happening throughout the country, and it's not really easy for us to think of these as two different things. And I think, the simultaneous occurrence of both of these trends is backed up by the fact that the PTI did not achieve significant electoral success until it adopted the same strategies of the PPP and the PMLN, right? So until it also brought into its fold the same electables, right, that were contesting elections with the PPP and the PMLN. Many of the people that won on behalf of the PTI are also dynastic, have also switched from other political parties. So I think what happened, however, was that the PPP and PMLN focused their attention primarily on the first trend, right? So electable politics, weak organizational structure, more of the same. And they largely neglected the second trend that the PTI was able to capitalize on more. And we could argue, I think, whether the focus on social media and narrative building is really only appealing to a small segment of the population, which I think, again, is the argument. But it's very clear that PTI had an ability to make inroads in various populations. And to succeed in today's Pakistan, it seems like you need to be responding to these trends simultaneously. And so while the role of electables, I agree, has remarkable staying power in Pakistan, right? And this is the case of feudals in much of rural Pakistan. These traditional power dynamics are also starting to feel pressure. So we are seeing important changes in the relative autonomy of an individual voter in making decisions and making demands on politicians and electoral candidates. We have also seen the role of the local feudal change, right? As we've had urbanization, severe links with the feudals, we've seen increasing Islamist influence, which is challenging traditional kinship or biradari ties. And along with this type of urbanization has come other necessary changes, and these include the central role that political machines have played in transmitting information about citizen preferences up the political party ladder. So all that to say that in the context of these weakening traditional ties, Imran Khan and the PTI were able to effectively craft a narrative of the main rival political parties as being elite, as being anti-people, as being pro-Western. And we see this in the way in which Imran Khan's rhetoric has existed over the last few years, right? So we've had the alleged conspiracy that the US was behind his ouster in the no confidence vote. This conspiracy was believed by a large segment of Pakistan's population. About 45%, according to polling data in June of 2022, believed that the US was behind the no confidence vote, 45%. This narrative also meant that Imran Khan was able to create distance between himself and the military. And in fact, there was an effort at showing himself as being more nationalistic of the two institutions, right? The two being him and the PTI and the military. So Khan alleging that an American conspiracy was behind his no confidence motion, that outside forces were behind the ouster, allowed him to paint himself as the true voice of the people. And the opposition, which was now being apparently supported by the military, was portrayed as being corrupted by outside influence. And so in some ways, I think that Imran Khan was very effective at standing for what the military for so long had itself sought to represent. And so he was able to present himself as a guardian of Pakistan, an overtly nationalist face. He spoke up for Muslims world over, whether it was in Palestine or Kashmir. He took a strong stance on issues with the United States, with India, and he could claim to bring respect and status to a country that very much felt the lack of it, right? And for good reason. I mean, I think that's another topic. But for many years, many Pakistani citizens felt at the receiving end of a lot of Western action with which they did not agree. And so for this nation that felt maybe perhaps used by the West, aware of the hypocrisy that often accompanies U.S. foreign policy, this claim to improving Pakistan's status really resonated. To be clear, in Imran Khan's narrative, while I think it's important, resonated in part because the background conditions of the domestic and global economy were working in that favor, right? So at the time of when Pakistan's economy started tanking, and obviously is doing very poorly today, polling data shows that the PTI did lose support, right? So even his narrative was not immune to the economic crisis that was happening. 4 months prior to his no confidence vote, polling data shows that the PMLN was starting to get more support than the PTI at that moment. As soon as the no confidence vote happened, the PDM took over, the PMLN leading the way. It was very easy for the populace to switch the blame of the economy from the PTI back over to the PMLN, and support for the parties switched once again. So And another thing to note is that Imran Khan's narrative of corruption is quite clever in the sense that it allows him to link the economic crisis also more clearly with this corrupt elite that is the PMLN and the PPP in his telling of this. So just to conclude, some final thoughts. Of course, we can't end without talking a little bit about how the events of May 9th have changed all of this and changed them once again so radically. The military has not pulled any punches in dismantling the PTI, as we have known it thus far. It has successfully applied pressure on the PTI's electables, right? So this is obviously another problem with weak organizational party structure, is the electables that make up a party are maybe more susceptible to pressure that's applied on them by outside powers like the military. Some would argue that the events have also exposed weaknesses of the military. Some also suggest that maybe there are internal cleavages within the military, which raise questions about the stability of the institution. I think it's maybe too soon for us to start talking about an unstable military, but certainly these conversations are happening within the country. It's also clear to me that the maybe excessive reaction, right, that happened after the violent protests of May 9th are an indication that the military was taken by surprise by the events that followed after his arrest. And so I think all of these things like potential fractures, potential instability are things that we have to keep an eye on as we go forward. It's also, I think, important to remember, and it's very important to keep eye on the fact that the populace is unhappy, right? Both with the economy, and we saw protests just a couple of weeks ago about rising inflation and electricity costs, and also with the increasing restrictions on rights. So while for the time being, given the PTI's internal cohesion and its ability to function are under attack, and who knows what face the PTI will have in a few years and how coherent this organizational structure will be even over the next few months when the elections happen. I still think it's important for us, like, even given the events of May 9th and where we are today, for us to remember these overarching trends that have taken place over the last couple of years. Because even if the PTI is not going to look the same tomorrow as it has over the past few years, all of its mobilization and all of the support that it's received, that is not going away, right? We're not going to be able to turn that off. And so that energy is going to be manifested elsewhere. Whatever that shape looks like, I think is an open question. So I'll end here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Well, your turn, and your concentration will be on the external dimension, right?
Mostly.
Mostly, yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you to Professor Varshni for the very kind invitation to come down to Brown on a Friday afternoon and talk about a slightly somber topic if you've been following events in South Asia broadly, but specifically Pakistan, which seems to be in some ways in the eye of the storm at the moment. Let me just begin by sort of addressing the... Sorry. Let me begin by addressing the title of this afternoon's event, which is Political Crisis in Pakistan. Because actually there are several crises that are playing out at one given time. If you've been reading the news, if you read Pakistani newspapers, a new term that a lot of journalists really like at the moment is polycrisis, right? And so you ask them, what is a polycrisis? And a polycrisis is more than one crisis. But you know, that really is, I think, an important starting point, because it's important to remember that the crisis that is playing out right now isn't purely just a political one. Pakistan is facing a very deep-rooted, serious economic crisis that is testing the country's solvency, to sort of, put it bluntly. I'm not an economist by training, but I was able to speak to people and get some sort of facts and figures, which I just want to start off with to give you a sense of what the situation is economically speaking. So Pakistan at the moment is staring down the barrel of a very steep macroeconomic adjustment. There's unprecedented high inflation. Overall, it's estimated to be at 38%. Electricity prices have skyrocketed. Food inflation is at an all-time high. There is social unrest, particularly amongst the middle and lower classes. There's been a steep depreciation of the rupee, which has fallen from about 160 to 170 rupees per dollar to about 320 rupees per dollar in just 2 years. Foreign exchange reserves are precariously low, with Pakistan banking on IMF bailout package. Pakistan is currently on something that's known as a standby agreement that is going to last until February. But once we hit February, it's inevitable that we will have to move into a new IMF agreement. The short answer to why is this happening, what's behind the sort of economic problems that Pakistan is facing did this happen overnight? No, it didn't really happen overnight. The economic crisis is a result of long-standing inability of Pakistan's elites to address structural inequities and to take hard decisions vis-a-vis the economy. What do these hard decisions look like? Well, these hard decisions look like things like, widening the tax to GDP ratio, bringing more people into the tax net, taxing agriculture, the manufacturing sector, putting an end to subsidies, which is actually the basis for a lot of the political elites to stay in power, given the fact that these political elites often rely on patronage networks with cartels, with very strong trade lobby groups. And this is going to be an important point that I'm going to come back to in the talk to explain when we sort of get into how Imran Khan is removed from power and what the PDM coalition government led by Shehbaz Sharif tried to do and failed to do in the months that followed. So there's the economic component to the crisis that Pakistan is facing at the moment, right? And then, yes, there is a political crisis. In 2018, when the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf under Imran Khan comes to power, as Niloufer mentioned, it wasn't really an even playing field. The PTI does come to power with the military's support, tacit backing. The military's decision to sort of start, in some ways, ending that relationship while Imran Khan was in power, leads to a situation that allows for the vote of no confidence then to unfold, which unseats Imran Khan. It's important to keep in mind that when the vote of no confidence takes place in April 2022, Imran Khan is removed constitutionally, sort of through constitutional means. But what happens afterwards in terms of the crackdown on the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf and the sort of the arrests of journalists and the crackdown on dissent, we can talk about how constitutional all of that actually is. After Imran Khan was removed, there was a sort of a coalition government that was in power for a very short period of time. And that coalition government has now relinquished power to essentially what is a caretaker setup. A caretaker setup that is mandated to sort of oversee elections taking place. And this is where the third crisis sort of that Pakistan is facing raises its head, which is Pakistan is currently facing a constitutional crisis, which has to do with the timing of elections. Pakistan has two provinces, the provinces of Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, it's been more than 90 days since the assemblies have been dissolved. The constitution mandates that elections be held within 90 days. The Supreme Court tried to take this issue up and has had to sort of reserve its judgment on this particular issue under pressure, which I think raises questions about also the judiciary's limits as being a sort of a third kind of sort of power center in this new political arrangement that is emerging. But now Pakistan is faced with the prospect of delayed elections because the coalition government sort of let go in the middle of August. If the government was to follow what the constitution requires, elections should be held by October, November. There are actually two sort of competing clauses within the Pakistani constitution that are at play here, that are in tension. One is the requirement that elections be held on time, and the other is this idea that if a census has been held, then delimitations be held and the new election take place based on the last census. And so one of the very last things that the coalition government led by Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif did through the Council of Common Interests was to sort of give its approval to the new census. And that has created this sort of crisis where we're now in a gray zone about whether or not elections are actually required to be held on time. I'm going to spend, as Professor Varshini sort of mentioned, and what I had planned to do was spend some, hopefully the majority of my talk talking about foreign policy. But it was important to sort of begin with this preamble because foreign policy obviously doesn't play out in a vacuum. Domestic politics is a very important sort of context or foil against which foreign policy then has the effects that it has. But before I get into foreign policy, and in fact, as a sort of as a device to move the conversation forward, I want to ask a sort of question about a sort of, I guess, a meta question about whether the political crisis that Pakistan is facing right now, whether this could have been averted. And I want to start with this political persona who frequently dominates Pakistan's headlines. This is Nawaz Sharif, three-time Prime Minister. Never once has Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif managed to successfully complete their term. The last premiership lasted from 2013 to 2016, although his political party, the PMLN, continued to rule until 2018, albeit under a different Prime Minister. I'm beginning with Nawaz Sharif because I think Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's third premiership began at, or sort of offered an inflection point to Pakistan, because this was the first time in Pakistan's history, in May 2013, that political power was constitutionally handed over from one democratically elected government to another democratically elected government. This has never happened in Pakistan's history before. So just in case you're not quite fully aware of the timeline, up till 2008, Pakistan is under sort of military rule. This is the Musharraf era. In 2008, Musharraf leaves power, and the Pakistan People's Party comes to power and completes 5 years of the government completes its tenure, although during the People's Party's time, even their prime ministers are being changed routinely. But then 2013 offers something that's never happened before, which is one government completes its term and a new government comes in. And it feels like, okay, maybe Pakistan is finally breaking with the past. And under the Pakistan People's Party, the army chief was General Pervez Ashraf Kiani, somebody who famously said that, he declared that he wanted to keep the military out of politics. Pakistan by this time is Events in Afghanistan are becoming more and more complicated. Pakistan's border with Afghanistan is becoming more and more restive, and the military has the ability for the Pakistan military to focus on politics in some ways is also constrained, because the military is now concerned with a war, a very high-profile war that's playing out on Pakistan's western border. So how do we then get from that situation where it seems like we've reached an equilibrium where the military knows that it's supposed to sort of stay in the barracks, and we have political parties sort of, they seem to be getting on message. They seem to understand what needs to be done to make things work. What changes? Why is the 2018 general election such a dirty election? Why is he unable to complete his third premiership? And this is where I want to perhaps give a little more space to foreign policy than is typically afforded. When Nawaz Sharif comes into power, he comes into power in May 2013. One of the first things he has to do in power is appoint a new army chief. And so in November 2013, he appoints General Rahil Sharif as his army chief. It's around this time that Pakistan, between 2013 and 2014, is also decides to take the very difficult decision of launching a counterinsurgency offensive. This is Operation Zarb-e-Azab. It's actually the largest inland counterinsurgency offensive that has ever been waged anywhere in the world. And this decision was taken by the army chief in tandem with the political leadership, because Pakistan was facing in 2013 an existential threat from terrorism, primarily from the Pakistani Taliban, or the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which was carrying out attacks with impunity, and which had, by this time, the Pakistan government was quoting a figure of about 50,000 Pakistani lives having been lost in the war on terror. So the army is involved in Zarb-e-Azab on the Western Front, and Nawaz Sharif is in power. Things seem to be going smoothly. The PMLN is a business sort of minded, business focused political party. It's very keen to attract foreign investment. The PMLN is very keen to attract an investment from China. In 2015, President Xi Jinping is going to make a historic trip to Pakistan. It'll be President Xi's first foreign visit that year, where he comes and he announced $46 billion of investment in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is going to be a flagship sort of venture of the One Belt, One Road initiative. So it seems like there's stability, investment is coming in. It's not really clear what could possibly go wrong, but things do go wrong, because under the surface, old rifts begin to appear between the civilian leadership and the military leadership. And I'm going to argue that India policy is a key reason for Nawaz Sharif's falling out for a third time with the military. So when Nawaz Sharif comes to power in 2013, he takes this decision, which in hindsight, many people now agree wasn't a very good decision. He decides to keep the two portfolios with himself. Foreign policy and national security. And anybody who studies Pakistan's sort of checkered history of democracy knows that one of the key issues of contention or policy areas that the military is very protective about is foreign policy, and particularly India policy, because the presence or the existence of India as this much bigger nuclear armed neighbor is it's a part of Pakistan's creation story, but it's also something that justifies a very large military industrial complex in Pakistan, where the military is able to continue to have the sway and the say that it does. And so when Nawaz Sharif comes into power in 2014, I don't know if I have a picture of this, but in 2014, there's a change in power in India too. In May 2014, Prime Minister Narendra Modi comes to power and invites heads of state from all South Asian countries, heads of government, heads of state to attend the swearing in. And Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif is very interested to go and make this appearance. If you know Pakistan's history, the last time Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was in power, his premiership was cut short, infamously around the Kargil war that India and Pakistan fought in 1999. Prior to Kargil, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif had sort of very bold ambitions and plans about sort of resetting relations with India. So Prime Minister Vajpayee visited Lahore, was hosted by Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. Famously, a Lahore Declaration was signed. It seemed as if these two neighbors are also turning a corner. So fast forward to his third premiership, it seems as if Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif felt that he had unfinished business left with India, and he wanted to sort of, make it possible for, amongst many other things, to see a resumption of trade between India and Pakistan. So he attends the swearing in. This is in 2014. In 2015, the two prime ministers, Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, again meet, this time on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Ufa, where they issue an Ufa declaration, saying, which is a joint statement negotiated by the Indian and Pakistani diplomatic teams. That joint statement is going to be very politically costly for Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif when he comes home, because unlike previous joint statements, Nawaz Sharif lets the word Kashmir be sort of slide from that joint statement. So he comes back home, he's put on the mat. The Foreign Secretary apparently says that he was explicitly told that there should be no word wrangling over the joint statement. And if you put this together with the fact that Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif has kept the foreign affairs and national security portfolios with himself, there's this increasing sense or view in the Pakistan military that Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif is trying to personalize diplomacy with Prime Minister Modi. There's this sense that India policy is being privatized, or is taking place away from the view of the military. This leads to a growing sense of disquiet within the armed forces. In December 2015, Prime Minister Modi is famously going to stop over in Lahore on his way back from Afghanistan, and he's going to meet Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif and attend Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's granddaughter's wedding. A few weeks later, there's going to be an attack in India. This is the Uri attack, and suddenly relations between India and Pakistan are going to come to a halt. In October 2016, Dawn Leaks happens, right? What is Dawn Leaks? Apparently, in a cabinet meeting, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif expresses displeasure at the Pakistan military for its sponsorship, allegedly, of non-state actors and organizations that have harmed Pakistan's international reputation, right? So we're beginning to see the makings of a head-on collision between a third-time premier who has old scores to settle, right? He's also in the process of trying to arraign former President Musharraf, the last army chief who had ousted him from power. And you have the Pakistan military, which is feeling sort of increasingly wary of what's going on. We come to 2017. And in 2017, an Indian businessman by the name of Sajan Jindal, I believe that was the name, flies to Pakistan, lands in a private aircraft in Islamabad, and is taken by a private car to a hill resort, which is about 40 minutes away from Islamabad's capital. and is hosted by Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif and by Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's daughter. And Sajjan Jindal is said to be a friend of the Nawaz Sharif family. He's also said to be a back channel contact between the BJP government that is in power in Delhi and the PMLN government in Pakistan. So this isn't exactly an innocuous sort of, old friends meeting one another. Political parties as well as the military view this very unfavorably in Pakistan. It also doesn't help that by this time Sajjan Jindal has acquired the reputation of somebody who actually curated an hour-long meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif on the sidelines of the SARC of a SARC meeting in Kathmandu. So by this time, it's clear that the military and Nawaz Sharif are sort of on different camps. And it's at this time that something very peculiar begins to happen in Pakistan, in particularly in Islamabad. Along the highways, banners start going up with the face of Pakistan's army chief, Rahil Sharif. Right? Nobody's sure who's put up these banners. Nobody's sure, why they've sort of appeared the way they have overnight. But there seems to be at the same time a very interesting PR campaign taking place, with the military once again vying for public space in a way that hasn't really taken place since the military stepped back from politics in 2008 and was content to sort of, in some ways lead from the back. I've spent quite a bit, trying to lay this out, but I've done this because I want you to sort of understand the context for Project Imran Khan, right? Why Imran Khan? What did Nawaz Sharif do wrong, right? Why is the 2018 election such a dirty election? Why are political supporters of the PMLN slowly weaned away? Why are political party members encouraged and paid money to leave the political party? Why is a third front opened up in South Punjab, and encouraged to join the PTI? This is the sort of, there is this rather complicated backstory for the incentives for the military to manage the 2018 election. So we come to 2018, and it seems like, we're at a new equilibrium. We have a prime minister and an army chief and an ISI chief that seem to be on the same page, both as far as foreign policy and domestic policy are concerned, right? And so images like this left one of Imran Khan and General Bajwa and General Faiz Hamid became very popular, basking in the sun, winter sun in Islamabad and holding their sort of catching up on what needs to be done. A lot of emphasis on this one-page formula that all three of us are on the same page. But again, remember the 2018 election. Imran Khan is in power, but is in power with a razor-thin majority, right? A few coalition members here or there. That's how how close the 2018 election was and how it was managed. So some political, politicians were bought off, encouraged to join this party. They could easily be sort of encouraged to join, come off and join a different party. Imran Khan is not a politically secure prime minister when the PTI is in power in 2018. And that becomes the rationale or the justification for Imran Khan to then start playing a certain brand of politics, which is populist politics, right? Because he's so vulnerable, because he knows that he is where he is and that can all go away. So we see Imran Khan start issuing populist statements. We see Imran Khan very reluctant to take away the subsidies that are eating away at the Pakistan economy, right? The subsidies that are so costly that the IMF sort of withholds its final $2 billion payment. We see Imran Khan issue populist sort of statements on things like Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan, which is just wrapping up. And so when the Taliban walk into Kabul, and that's a whole other story about how that happened. Imran Khan says things like the Taliban have broken the shackles of slavery, because these sort of statements play very well to domestic audiences. And then there's this whole question of why was Imran Khan in Moscow on the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? Because he says we're not going to be dictated to by America. That's what he says in public, at big public jalsas. It plays really well because nobody likes being dictated to by the United States. But that populist rhetoric is also now going to make the Pakistan military wary, because the relationship with the United States is not one that the military is keen to sort of, throw out of the window. The Pakistan military is very dependent on the relationship with the United States for spare parts, for military modernization. Even though the defense partnership with China has been picking up pace, the United States remains an extremely important player as far as the Pakistan military is concerned. So we're beginning to see rifts appear between the military leadership and Imran Khan once again, and a civilian prime minister once again. And this becomes then the context for, there are other events that also happen here, particularly disagreement over the continuation of General Faiz Hamid as ISI chief. Because Faiz Hamid is instrumental in the 2018 election, in the wheeling and dealing that actually brings Imran Khan to power. And so within this sort of three-person relationship, Imran Khan is very keen to keep Faiz Hamid on board. And doing so would have put Faiz Hamid sort of in a prime spot to be the next army chief. This is obviously not something that is going to go down well with General Bajwa, because the prerogative of sort of, who gets to actually pick de facto terms, who gets to pick the next, have a say in who the next senior appointment is with the army chief. And so we begin to see this relationship fray as well. I'm going to conclude with these thoughts, very brief. And there are other aspects of Pakistan's foreign policy that I haven't been able to get into, but I'm happy to sort of, for us to talk about it in Q&A. The first is that, the poly crisis that Pakistan is facing right now is neither linear, nor should we really see it as unicausal in the sense that it can be attributed to any one specific sort of political actor or political event. I think it's more useful to understand the situation that Pakistan is currently has found itself in as the result of a confluence of events and circumstances that have compounded existing underlying deficits. At the moment, general elections are currently slated for February 2022, but now there's a real question about whether Pakistan continues with the extended sort of caretaker setup that it has now for the unforeseeable future, because an unelected, unaccountable caretaker setup that is led by the military is actually better placed to take some of the more difficult political decisions that political parties deem too costly to take. And that's a really difficult question that now Pakistan faces. And so if elections happen in 2022, will those political parties that come to power, A, do they come to power organically, and B, if they come to power organically, do they have the appetite to then undertake the structural reform that is needed to get Pakistan out of this economic quagmire? And the last point is foreign policy remains an extremely unpredictable, but I also believe deeply that this is a combustible variable given the security crisis that Pakistan is also now facing. with a resurgence of the terrorist threat and the fact that the military is going to be overstretched as it tries to both manage national politics as well as counter-terror efforts. So I'll end with that. I think I may have gone over time,
That's
but
fine.
thank you, and I look forward to questions.
I'm sure there are lots of questions, so, but let me start. Maybe three things. One, there is a straightforward answer to that, and there is something that perhaps we can use political science theories, or maybe we shouldn't. But anyway, let me ask the question. Instead of running into problems of very difficult political management, why didn't the military, or why shouldn't the military stage an old-fashioned coup and take over power? As opposed to, since 2008, managing now, it's about 14 years, 15 years of difficult management. Nawaz Sharif is becoming pro-India, let's get rid of him. Khan is becoming, is developing anti-American positions, very strident anti-American positions. The military can't afford it, so let's get rid of him. Why is the very difficult management of civil-military relationship, given that civilians don't necessarily follow the logic of military interests or unlikely to? I mean, generally, that's not what they do. That's not what civilian politicians do. They have their own logic of functioning. They have to worry about being re-elected. They have to think about their constituencies, right? They are not going to follow the dictates of the military all the time. And then the military has to manage these recalcitrant politicians, right? Who more often than not, sooner than later, develop a political program which is more consistent with their interests than the interests of the military. Yeah? So there could be some very straight, I know the answers that some journalists would give, but I want to hear political scientists give an answer to this question, right? Two, I do remember a time when a very great deal of democratic optimism was stored, if you will, in the judiciary as an actor. That the judiciary, especially given what it did to General Musharraf, the judiciary might be an agent of democratization of the polity, and there was real optimism among the circles that I know and speak with. Thoroughly thoughtful people. They are not in one side or the other. Just an insightful, thoughtful political analysis that they were coming up with. How do we understand what happened to the judiciary in this civilian-military clash? And why it had to, if you will, buckle under, if at all that's the right term. I mean, we are analyzing these difficult problems in India right now. Is it buckling under? Right? So how do we understand this phenomenon after being so important to the ouster of Musharraf? I think most people would agree with that. So important to the ouster of Musharraf, not single-handedly ousting Musharraf, but how do we understand the role of judiciary vis-a-vis the civilians and the military? Is the second question. And And the third, is perhaps more easily answerable. We know from available data, repeated surveys, of both Pakistan, done especially by Gallup, by Ijaz for a long time. I don't know where he is right now, but
Still there.
still there. And in repeated surveys in India, foreign policy and security did not play a central role in India's electoral politics until recently. Balakot is for scholars of Indian politics who paid a lot of attention to data, is the real turning point. Real turning point. And Modi's ability to use foreign policy, security policy for electoral purposes is far and away unparalleled. Think of the following. A few months after the attack on Mumbai, Congress party won even more handsomely. November 28th was the attack on Mumbai. 168 people died. Many elite circles in Pakistan, including official circles in Pakistan, said those were sponsored by the military, right? The vigilante forces. Whether or not we can prove it in a very positive causal sense, right? Positivist causal sense, not positive, positivist causal sense. But I think the hypothesis was widely accepted, and if it's not, you should tell us. But anyway, it did not have an impact. It was widely accepted in India, and it did not have an impact on the elections. But Balakot did. We can show you with data that it provided, it was other than Modi's personal popularity, which is the highest, which is 25% of those who voted for BJP, every fourth voter said they voted for me, not BJP, but Modi. That's it's sturdy data. It's repeatedly it's appearing, that kind of data. Second was Balakot, 18%. 25% was Modi, 18% was Balakot. This is a very surprising development in India. But foreign policy has always been, correct me if this statement is wrong, a much bigger factor in Pakistan's domestic politics than in India. And what's his name? The piece written by Hopkins, scholar who studied Jamaat Islami in the beginning, but Wali has done a piece on this and then analyzed. Now, the question that follows from this is whatever is happening to India right now, and I think national security and foreign policy now will play a much bigger role than they ever have, right? Which has implications for the coming elections also. I analyzed that at India International Center some weeks ago in a panel. Now, given, if you will, the constancy of India and the United States and of late Afghanistan in the overall domestic politics of Pakistan, why would any civilian politician, especially after what happened to Nawaz, why would any civilian politician have any proclivity towards mending fences with India? You just can't pay. You just can't pay off, right? Do you think, therefore, the India-Pakistan animosity, now of course being, now it's being fed by India also in a very different way, whatever India's role in the past, but in a very different, now it's domestic politics also. It's being picked up by domestic politics, which was simply not true earlier. So is there any way one can think about a civilian political move which could be pro-India as a way to somehow alter the existing political equilibrium? Or as some analysts say, that India-Pakistan relationship cannot be repaired until the military says it has to be repaired. as opposed to civilians. So those are the three thoughts for you to discuss before we go forward. I'm sure there are lots of questions. I can see eyes brimming with questions, if you will. Yeah. Whichever way you want to take it. Yeah.
Do you want to go first?
You can go first.
Okay. Are you sure?
Up to you.
Okay. So I'll just offer a few thoughts that maybe answer your questions, maybe don't. But so obviously these are big, important questions. For the first one about the military coup and the likelihood of that occurring, I think there's a couple of answers. I'm curious what Fahd and others think. I think the first is that, and Aqil Shah has written about this. She says that the Pakistan military prefers being an arbiter rather than a direct ruler. And that has largely been their preference, even historically, right? Obviously, there have been many examples of direct military rule, but increasingly that has been the case. And I think in part that's because the military cares a lot about its reputation and its integrity as an institution. And so I think the idea of getting involved directly at a stage where the economic crisis is so severe doesn't really fit with its own desire to maintain its reputation. So I think from the supply side, the likelihood of a military coup rather than a hybrid regime seems unlikely to me. And then I think also from the demand side, I would say that there's less appetite for a coup domestically than might have been the case in the past. Obviously, internationally also there's less appetite for a coup. So I think both from the supply and the demand perspective, it seems unlikely to me, and I'm curious if you disagree, that a direct military coup is likely to happen at any point. For the third question.
So go on with difficult political management. That's better than a direct running of the polity.
Yeah, it is. I do think that May 9th, it's interesting to me to think about both the short term and the long term in terms of how much May 9th will be a pivotal turning point. Because even though there are many similarities, as we outlined with the past, the direct attacks on the military on and after May 9th were to some extent unprecedented and were to some extent unexpected, right? And so I think that the reaction that we've seen since the events on May 9th, I think, reflect the surprise and the unexpected nature. So potentially there will be some rethinking about what makes sense for the military because of these events. But in general, I don't think that's where the direction is going in. So as for foreign policy and security policy playing a role for the populace and in voting behavior, so this is a really interesting question. I'm interested to know about Balakot as well. I didn't realize that was such an important factor. So that's fascinating. So I did a survey with a colleague in about 2015 on voting behavior and foreign policy, and we found in Pakistan, and we found that voters do not hold foreign policy as a central attribute of a candidate when casting a decision. So this was in a conjoint survey experimental technique, and among a number of different attributes, including partisanship, domestic policy, kinship or ethnic ties, and so on, foreign policy was the least important characteristic. And in this case, we had measured foreign policy as being relationship with India. So it was a salient attitude. Now, we can't say for sure what an event like Balakot would do, right? So generally, foreign policy writ large doesn't seem like people are voting on the basis of foreign policy writ large, but it's very possible at a time when people's sensitivities are heightened, right, at a time of crisis, then people might vote according to those things. So we can't rule that out. I will say that for me personally, and I'm curious how much you think this translates to India, but I think that foreign policy, like Imran Khan's attitudes or rhetoric about India or the West, about Islam on the global stage and so on, for me, I think has much more to do with nationalism and status and populist rhetoric than it does about foreign policy per se. And so I wonder, and this is an open question, but I wonder in India too if it's about Pakistan, right? But it's also about Hindu nationalism, and it's also about the Muslim minority, right? And so I wonder if there's more to it than just a foreign policy decision. At least in Pakistan, I think that there's more multifaceted angles about the way in which our attitudes to the U.S. matter. And I think this is because of long history, like the last 15 years, drones were such a central aspect, and it's not, people cared about drones, they cared about the U.S., but they cared much more about the fact that Pakistan's sovereignty was being ostensibly affected, right? And so I think these issues of status are coming across, and Imran Khan was able to successfully tap into those, which is a change, right, from patron-client relations. And I think that's an important switch. Do you want to go address a few points?
Yeah, sure. So I think in no particular order, on the foreign policy front, it's worth remembering that political parties in Pakistan and the mainstream political party, no mainstream political party in Pakistan campaigns on the promise of sort of war with India, right? All political parties, be it the People's Party or the PMLN or the PTI, you can look at their election manifestos. They all say we will improve relations with India. We want to improve relations with India. We want a peaceful neighborhood. I think that's an extremely important point to start with because, when Imran Khan came to power, he said that if India takes one step forward, I will take two steps forward. He in his very first
I heard that speech.
live address to the
Plus
nation.
Tijarat also, he said, right?
So improving relations with India is something that politicians have always staked a lot on. Except, I think things fundamentally changed after 5th August 2019, when events in Kashmir made it extremely politically cost prohibitive for any Pakistani politician to say normalization with India until the revocation of Article 370 is reversed. This in some ways did become a point of contention then between the PTI and the military at the time, because General Bajwa was keen for actually improving relations with India. And so by this point, the Pakistan military's calculus on India has undergone a certain change, because the Pakistan military recognizes the economic problems that Pakistan is in, and that Pakistan can't be spending, just cannot keep up with that kind of spending to sort of, in a hostile equilibrium. And so I think with General Bajwa, there was this keenness to explore a normalization of relations. The problem was that August 5th, 2019 had happened, and Imran Khan had taken a very hawkish position on Kashmir. Not just Imran Khan, but all political parties. Maryam Nawaz was vilifying India for what the human rights conditions that were taking place in Kashmir. So I think in some ways Kashmir became more politically evocative and has now become more politically evocative, and we actually haven't seen a political party manifesto since 2019. So I would be very curious to see how political parties phrase their sort of policy on India, given that this is going to be the first election that Pakistan is going to have had since that time, and since no politician, I mean, to talk about trade with India in Pakistan right now is politically radioactive. There have been cases where trade ministers, finance ministers have had to sort of make very embarrassing public U-turns on the issue of trade just because a signal was given from one quarter that this is something we'd like to see, and then suddenly, this can't be done. The roadblock is just too big. I completely agree, though, with Niloufer. I think it's more complicated than just saying that this is about foreign policy. I think in both India and Pakistan, the issue of the other has merged with a certain brand of populist politics, where it's not just about a foreign policy other, but it's actually the act of otherizing, both domestically and externally. Domestically in the sense that anybody who's not on board with you is less of a patriot, is less of a nationalist, right? Is out to compromise your national security. And so I think the salience of foreign policy is it's a particular kind of foreign policy that's being amplified. You know, Pakistan has relations with China. You know, it's not at all. There are no partisan cleavages there. Or I think so. You know, a certain type of relationship has to be framed before it gains that salience. And on the question about, you know, why doesn't the military just stage an all out coup? I guess the question is why should it? You know, it's got its proxies where they need to be. They're doing the work that the military needs to be. Niloufer said that, you know, it looks bad. There's a big reputational cost for the military to be in power in Pakistan and leading from the front. In fact, there was a reputational cost in the Musharraf era. The only reason the Musharraf era lasts as long as it did is because 2 years after the coup, 9/11 happened. Otherwise, before 9/11, Musharraf was putting together a King's Party, the PMLQ, and sort of moving towards elections that were then held in 2002, and there was a rubber stamp legislature of sorts that was created. But Pakistan's that period of military rule was sanctioned from the outside. It was bankrolled by the United States, which needed to fight a war in Afghanistan, and found a very pliant person in Pakistan to do it for it. So those are just two thoughts. I think right now for the Pakistan military, it's, you know, it's sitting comfortably. It's cost prohibitive. For a coup would be cost prohibitive reputationally. It would also it would go against a very real requirement that the Pakistan army has right now, which is Pakistan does need a professional army. Because it needs a professional army because the security threats that Pakistan faces are, you know, in many ways they're legitimate. Pakistan, be it internal or external, and for that reason, the military cannot afford to be sort of turn Pakistan into a, you know, a full on military junta.
Questions? Can you raise your hands? Who will start? Can you also introduce yourself a little? Yeah? Yeah, please.
I'm Jason. In your opinion, what could Pakistan do to fix their current issue?
Fix the
Fix their current issue.
current problems. Very big question. So, yeah. Okay, let's go further. Binish?
Hi, my name is Binish. I'm part of the PhD program in political science here at Brown. My first question is about, Niloufer, you spoke a lot about the role that the voters have played and, you know, the party politics that's involved, and the autonomy that we've seen kind of maybe grow over time. My question is, specifically you mentioned the May 9th incident, right? At one point we do see, all these big jalsas and all this big populist politics, playing up, and it's kind of part of the reason why Imran Khan was propped up to this extent in the first place. But then you see May 9th and then the backlash from it. The kind of, and I know that Fahd also spoke about it, the civil liberties, the fact that, you can't even take Imran Khan's name on television right now. Basically the opposition is kind of really, really being stopped and crushed at this point in time. So is there any autonomy that voters have in this kind of a situation? And then my second question was in relation to the impact of foreign policy, and I think, Fahd, you kind of alluded to it when you're talking about the impact that the US has had, but thinking ahead in terms of the geopolitics of US-China competition now, how does that impact the domestic politics of Pakistan, where we're trying to there's remnants of still wanting to have favors from the US or maintain that kind of relationship or maintain that trust, but then you're also battling that with wanting good relations with China, and that's going to be a sore point in the future. It still is becoming a sore point right now with the US-Pakistan relations. How do we navigate that, and what impact does that have on domestic politics and the stability of domestic politics in Pakistan?
Can I add a little bit to what Binish is saying about US-China relationship? US-India also coming closer and closer.
Yeah.
There is no doubt. I've been briefing State Department, hearing them, and I'm under Chatham House rules, so I can't tell you who said what. It is pretty unbelievable how clear the position is about the need to come closer and closer to India in the current international climate, and why they should come together. You know, before any briefing, they also have to tell you why they brought you in to brief, right? And yes, we can't say anything more than that. We will break Chatham House rules. So the US-China tensions and US-India coming closer, and they're connected both. Yeah. And under that, Pakistan, what the question being should ask. Okay. Maybe a third question. I have the two more hands. Let's go to you first, and then we'll come to you.
Hi, I'm Siraj. I'm also a PhD candidate here in the department. Niloufer, you mentioned that kind of thinking about the historical context and thinking about the context of political culture. You mentioned the political scientists studying the patterns of authoritarianism and democracy since 1947 find that this regular swing, this oscillation between more democratic and more authoritarian periods, and talk about like how there are all of these different theories for why that is. I'm curious if there are any of those theories that you find like convincing, or if there's a combination of theories that you find most convincing. And also, kind of a sort of addendum to that question is, one of the specific theories you mentioned is that the Pakistani populace is simply not ready for democracy. And that stuck out to me because that's one of the theories that I, just speaking anecdotally, hear all the time from people I know in like the Pakistani American community. And it's one that I feel like skeptical about, but I don't know what to make of it. And so I'm curious if you have more thoughts on that, or specifically like what are the kind of norms or aspects of kind of political culture that people who promote that theory might seem to be missing.
And according to you, the Pakistani American community that you deal with, they say political culture is the obstacle to readiness for democracy?
Oh no, they just say that, Pakistani people don't even know what democracy is. That's something that I hear, like, often, just anecdotally from,
So how should a scholar deal with that popular perception about
Yes, exactly.
obstacles to democracy? Yeah, is the question, right?
Right.
Okay, those three then. Whoever wants to go first.
Sure. So the first question on what the solution is, that's a great question. And I don't think anybody has really the answer to that, or at least people think they have the answer to something. But at this point, it's I mean, the stakes of the crisis are so high that everything is very, very risky. There are two sort of possible routes that Pakistan could both sort of be seen as solutions, right? One is that Pakistan is allowed to have free and fair elections, which will bring to power political parties that represent or at least have the mandate to then sort of take difficult decisions, right? And that voters over time, we can sort of get back onto the path that we sort of came off of after 2013, which is that elections become issue-based around, and voters start holding politicians accountable. And this can only happen after election. It's a process. It can't happen with interruptions. The big question mark on this front, though, is then do politicians have the appetite to take the difficult decisions that need to be taken, because those are they're going to be politically unpopular decisions, right? Like taking away subsidies, making things expensive, because Pakistan is going to need to go back to the IMF. The other solution, and I am hesitant to call this a solution because it's not one that I sort of personally, I think it's problematic. There are some proponents who think this is a more viable solution, but it's one in which you enter a period of an extended sort of an extended kind of caretaker setup. And all institutions of state come on board, and there's a grand national dialogue, similar to sort of the Charter of Democracy that Niloufer had a picture of from 2006, where you say that, okay, we need to come up with a new charter of politics, a new charter of economy. We need to sort of redefine what, you know, the social contract here, and you know, that takes accountability out of the picture, but it also takes democracy out of the picture, and but it does give then create the space for those difficult decisions to take place, because if people are burning their electricity bills under a caretaker setup, I mean, the caretaker setup isn't going to lose any sleep because, you know, they don't have an election to win.
Mm-hmm.
So not perfect answers, but I think those are the sort of two sort of pathways to, I mean, two things that present themselves as possible solutions, if that makes sense. And to Binesh's question on foreign policy and, you know, navigating the US-China relationship, I think is difficult. It's something that Pakistan has actually, you know, since 2015, Pakistan has tried to sort of say that we don't believe in camp politics. In fact, going to Russia on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, which I think was terrible timing, but also terribly bad luck, because the invasion hadn't happened then. The invasion happened once the cabinet was in Moscow. You know, but Pakistan's point on that was, if we don't go to Russia, that is camp politics, because there we're sending a signal that we're Team USA. Right? And in this growing era of multipolarity, why shouldn't we be, you know, making all kinds of sort of overtures? Pakistan's policy right now on China is that it's not at the expense of relations with the United States, and its relations with the United States are not at the expense of relations with China. The thing is, I think decision makers in Pakistan find this a very sort of comfortable sort of space to operate in. But the problem is the message landing on target, right? Either in Beijing or in Washington, and there I suspect we're running into problems, because the competition with the Sino-US rivalry is really picking up pace in a way where I don't think there are going to be any buyers for this sort of idea that you can be friends with China and friends with Washington at the same time. Interestingly enough, with on the India-US alliance, you know, calling it an alliance, but I think
Not a formal one. That,
strategic partnership.
yes.
It's
Yeah, I mean, it's almost an alliance without being one. That kind of, that, if whatever the term is in IR for that. Yeah.
The thing is, I think it's, for Pakistan, two things. There are two sort of ways at looking at this. One is that, you know, any attempt at military modernization within India, or, you know, the acquisition of new defense hardware, for instance, be it from Russia, you know, the S-400s that India is acquiring from Russia are going to be stationed on the border with Pakistan. So, and those kinds of developments are always going to come at a cost to Pakistan, where Pakistan is going to have to then advance equally to sort of offset that asymmetry. But at the same time, I think there is this perception, and even military stakeholders in Pakistan now say this, that, you know, we're not threatened by the US sort of growing partnership, this strategic partnership with India. We also want our own independent relationship with the United States. And so this moving away from the language of hyphenation is something that policymakers are becoming good at. Pakistan is, I think, expect that if you think that the Indo-Pacific is heating up as a theater of activity, and if Pakistan stabilizes, which I think hopefully all of us in the room, you know, share that aspiration that Pakistan does stabilize, then I think Pakistan will say that, you know, Pakistan is also a peripheral actor within the Indo-Pacific, right? Why are we, you know, let Pakistan also have sort of naval patrols or whatnot in the Indo-Pacific, because we don't see this as being against our security in any way. Pakistan's issue with the Indo-Pacific is that there should be no single net provider of security in the Indo-Pacific. As long as that is not the case, then Pakistan is okay with any kind of arrangement, be it the Quad or India or whatnot.
Did you have a response to the Pakistani American community's argument presented to you by our PhD scholar?
Yeah, so I have a few thoughts on that, and also a few thoughts on like what we should do. So I mean, good thing we're like political scientists in an ivory tower and not policymakers, because we can identify problems much more easily than we can identify solutions. But it seems like one key thing to do is let elections happen, right? So there was a debate among Pakistan academics before the no confidence vote was going to happen too, about whether this was something that we thought was a good idea or not. And I would say some people were in favor of it because it would seem like the same page hybrid regime was a maybe particularly dangerous form of hybrid regime, right? But it seems very clear now for those of us who believe in democracy that letting elections just happen on schedule and letting the voters vote according to who they think is the best candidate was probably the right thing to do. And for me, I think personally, just letting elections happen on the schedule on which they're supposed to happen is the central and key thing to trying to get out of the situation. There is a very large amount of disillusionment in Pakistan right now. I was there this summer doing interviews for a project, and everybody wants to leave. And in fact, the immigration numbers that were just released by Gallup recently is really stark. So everybody's leaving. It's huge percentages, right? State elite capture is just, a lot of people just don't see a way to access the system, because there is no way. There's no pathway through parties. There's no pathway otherwise. This is why I think there was a lot of hope for the PTI. And then, this question about, I guess, theories of regime change, right, if you will, of like how Pakistan. So I was actually just reminded, because I was putting these slides together recently, and so Jinnah, at the time of independence, said the armed forces were the, quote, servants of the people. And then he had his quote where he told a general, "You do not make national policy. It is we, the civilians, who decide these issues. And it is your duty to carry out those tasks with which you are entrusted." And it's like pretty stark difference from what was intended at the time and what is happening today, right? And I think, I mean, it's a hard question to answer in a way, like how did we end up here? I think that, I guess, political science theories aside, there were just a lot of, I don't know how else to describe them, but like bad luck, like Jinnah died, Liaqat Ali Khan died. There was all this political vacuum that happened afterwards, and then a lot of hard decisions on like land reform, et cetera, weren't taken. And so you have this now situation where the political parties are so weak organizationally that everybody's relying on the same 100 families that just keep reappearing in different forms in the same, in different forms, right? But they're the same actors. So yeah, I mean, I don't obviously, I don't buy that the Pakistani populace is not ready. I don't even know what that means. I think good comparisons are with India, right? At the time of independence in India, the time of independence for Pakistan, and like the fact that elections took place there. And I don't know what not ready means, but if you look at education numbers and percentages, like at the time of partition, India went through the whole process, right? So yeah, I think that is obviously a theory that's put forward. In terms of adjudicating between them, the only comparisons we have are with places like India, and I don't think those theories really stand ground then. Yeah. And I'm sure you agree.
Last round of questions, sir. You.
My name is Muntazir Ali. I'm a religious studies PhD student here. So I've been thinking about the special investment facilitation council that the new army chief has announced, and he's been meeting the business community in both Lahore and Karachi, and he's been talking about sort of a revival. So do you think that's in keeping?
Can you say a bit more about that? I follow. I follow the Dawn every day, but anyway, I may have missed
this.
They
announced the special investment facilitation council when the previous government, the medium government, was there, and the focus is on bringing in more investment and making Pakistan more investment friendly.
I see.
So he's been saying that we are going to do these. And so basically, the army is becoming involved in direct economic management. So do you think that's in keeping with previous trends? Because we have been talking about continuities and discontinuities. And the second question I have is, there is no sort of political ownership of that process, because now the caretaker government is in place, and without that political ownership that you were talking about, like it's needed for making, like taking those big difficult decisions, are we in for another managed election, even if they happen on time, manufactured mandate? Thank you.
Yeah, so let's take the last three here and then we'll give you 5 minutes, right? Because, yeah, Finn.
Oh, yeah, hi, Finney and Garrity, I teach in religious studies and South Asian studies. So I just wanted to ask if we can, is it relevant to bring religion into this conversation? To what extent is it important that these, whether you're speaking of Pakistan or India or the two interfacing, you're dealing with religiously inflected nationalisms? And also, how much power do you see vested in religious leadership and religious elites as kind of brokers of the power that does kind of come to reign and hold sway?
My name is Noman. I'm in the anthropology department. I had a question about the overlap of analytical terms with political rhetoric. So how do you, as political scientists, deal with the fact that the terms that you use are increasingly, or if they weren't always, making their way into popular politics? And I'm thinking in particular of elites, which was quite predominant in this.
What term?
Elites. You ascribed Imran Khan's popularity partly to the fact that he was able to co-opt local elites who derive their patronage through providing subsidy or through other means. While at the same time, in Imran Khan's own politics, elites is a very predominant term, as for most populists, and elites are to be blamed for a lot of things. So how do you distinguish your usage, or how do you maintain distance given the proximity of the analytics with the object analyzed?
Political science use of elites is different from Imran Khan's use of elites, is what he's asking.
And different from anthropologists, he said.
It's coming from discipline of anthropology, at least. Yeah.
This is just not a very complicated question, but if the democratic issue is fixed, if we have these kind of free and fair transfers of various administrations to one another, is there any party, candidate, or movement which is actually concerned with these unpopular beliefs or unpopular positions about decreasing these subsidies, increasing taxes, the things that would stave off the economic collapse? Or if the democratic issue is fixed, does that sort of still head Pakistan towards this economic crisis?
So you're asking whether democracy is what they're recommending, whether this will be actually a serious problem for the economy. That democracy and economic reform are in conflict.
Yeah.
That's the question. Very good one. Has been asked elsewhere as well, not simply in Pakistan. Are democracy and economic welfare in conflict? Economic reform, yeah.
Let's start because it's just the most fresh in my head right now. I don't think there is any mainstream political party right now that has the organizational support or the prospects of having the political mandate to be able to take the decisions that would essentially sever the basis of support, political support that they've depended on up till now, if that makes sense. Imran Khan came in and said he wanted to change the rules of the game, and he was, he tried to, and it just, or he alleged to have tried to, and he was, it was just too politically costly because he didn't have the political safety net to be able to. In fact, part of the mess that Pakistan is in right now is because weeks before the vote of no confidence, he rolled out subsidies on petrol and gas and electricity to just in some ways indemnify himself. Then Miftah Ismail, who was the finance minister under the coalition government, attempted to impose taxes on small traders and businessmen, and then they came out, burning signs and protesting, and he had to be removed from his position, even though it was a coalition government that had 7 months to sort of get through. But that's how difficult and how difficult it is to take the difficult kinds of decisions that need to be taken. Sorry, the
term of
I'm going to skip. That's such a good
elites.
question. It's too
Military economy.
You go ahead.
military economy.
Yeah.
Which one? Sorry,
Okay.
What was
The military has gotten so involved in the economy in
The-
recent
the
past, and now
special-
it's
the
trying to
special
invite
investment
private
finance.
sector in.
This is not the first time this has happened. Musharraf did this. The Special Investment Facilitation Council it's supposed to be a one window sort of operation that ease of doing business and allows sort of investment to come in. The problem is that it identifies lack of investment as being the problem that is preventing economic growth in the country. It's not. It's sort of it and thinks that attracting investment. I mean, the pledges that the new army chief is making is of attracting some $50 billion in the next 4 months. Pakistan hasn't had that kind of investment in the past 20 years, right? So it's very sort of rose tinted, and it's being said that money is going to be coming from Saudi Arabia and whatnot.
$50 billion cannot, even if they come to an economy which has about 370 billion of GDP, is going to be actually a disaster, something like that. For just more than 10% coming in like that will have all kinds.
Well,
of
the
distortion.
SIFC is being pitched or presented as, and the fact that the army chief is taking a personal interest, i.e., is leading it from the front. I mean, everybody has said this is reassuring because the army chief is now sort of the new finance minister for the country, but it doesn't address the issue of structural reform that Pakistan needs. It doesn't address the sort of the debt crisis, the energy crisis, the tax issue. The military is in many ways also complicit in this political economy that has developed in Pakistan over time.
Any answer to religion question or
Yes.
elite question?
So I'll take those two questions. Both are really excellent questions. So religion, there's a lot to talk about there. I think maybe I'll just very briefly mention, I think 2 trends happening at the local level, quote unquote, that I think are important. So one is, of course, the strengthening of the blasphemy party, the anti-blasphemy party, the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan. And I think that's interesting in the context of what we're discussing, because in some ways, the same group of the populist voters, et cetera, that are kind of younger, more urban, more like lower middle class, that you could have said that the PTI was appealing to, are also kind of the same constituency that the TLP are appealing to. And I think there's a lot going on there with issues of masculinity and issues of honor, which I think also overlap with some issues that are taking place in the PTI phenomenon, but are obviously different, right? Because they're not a mainstream party and so on. But that, I think, is a trend that everybody's focused on and should be focused on. Then the second trend, and I have a chapter in my book which deals with this, which is I think that with urbanization and with a little bit of the breaking apart of the links between the feudal and the client, again with quotes, we're seeing the replacement of the old electable, the feudal, with new actors, which I think Matt Nelson, SOS, calls the petty mullahs. And so there is this increase in the local cleric as becoming a patron, and in some cases they're able to replace the feudal and urbanizing areas as the local elite. They are being co-opted by political parties who are weak and who just want votes. And so that's why before every election in 2013 and 2018, you had these newspaper articles that are like, why are the PMLN having like 15 members of the banned anti-Shia 8SWJ on their party ticket, right? And so that's another, I think, phenomenon that's really interesting. At the national level, I definitely think Islam is really important. I don't think Islam per se is important in terms of the religion. I just think that, again, how it's wrapped up in issues of nationalism and status are really important. I think Imran Khan is a fascinating character because, and I think he does look at Modi in many ways and how Modi's used the Hindu identity and part of nationalism and getting a place on the national and international stage as really central. And there is a little bit of emulation there that I think is happening. So I think all of those trends are happening that are really important. On the elite question, I think this is a great question, for sure. And I don't think I have a good answer that I could offer in 60 seconds on the use of our language or rhetoric. But I think a really short answer, and maybe an unsatisfying one, but I think, I just think that Imran Khan, it's a contradiction, right? I think he absolutely has a party full of elites. And he is using anti-elite rhetoric. I think both of these things are facts, right? And we can debate whether the local elite term is the right one, or whether we want to use electable, or whether we want to use something else, right? But these are individuals who have historically amassed power and had positions in power in government with other political parties. Often they are dynasts. They have large land ownership. And this is not writ large, right? This is not everywhere. In KP, not always the case for the PTI, but certainly in parts of Punjab. And at the same time, he is offering these...
And
this,
Sindh?
And Sindh, the PTI has done less well in Sindh, because in Karachi, it's a little bit
Right.
different
Yeah,
dynamics, But at the national level, he's talking about anti-elite stuff. So I think it's just a pure contradiction. I think there's much more to unpack there, but I think at the base level, there is a contradiction. I do think, though, that he himself is able to present himself as not corrupt in the same way, just like the other populist leaders in the world have been able to, right? And I think that's effective. I think that goes a long way. So, yeah.
Well, it's time to bring this meeting to a close, but before we do that, a show of a motion of thanks, if you will, with a clap.